have your Bibles, please turn to Esther chapter 5. It's your first week here. We are going through the book of Esther. It's been just great going through this story and unpacking, a story that many of us may have remembered whenever we were kids in Sunday school class. But while you're turning there, I want to talk to you about a conversation I had last week. See, there was a member of this church that had passed away. And I reached out to his family just to know more about him. So I ended up talking with two of his daughters and his ex-wife. And they began to just unpack for me just about who this man was, how he influenced their lives, the legacy that they will remember him by. And so as they began to talk, it kind of took me in a different direction than I thought. Because they first told me that you have to understand where our relationship was at. Because it wasn't as good as it was right now, because in fact, for several years we had a fractured relationship. We weren't very close. He had left us, and so we're now just trying to go through the process of healing. And so when I asked what happened, she said, we had two daughters, then we had a son. And about a month old, the son passed away. You can imagine the deep grief that they both went through. And while they tried to grieve through this loss together, he pulled away. And in fact, he got heavy into drinking. It led to the eventual destruction of his marriage. And then wanting to get away from the pain, he decided to leave his whole family and move away. He thought maybe a new location would give him a new start, a new way of seeing things. But you know what happened while he was away? Something he never thought would occur. He encountered Jesus Christ. Now you might be sitting here saying, well, that's great, but you have to understand he grew up in a church just like this church there, and he thought, hey, everything was right. But for this very first time in his life, he came to realize it's about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And so in this encounter with him, he began to pray more. He began to read his Bible, and this love and his passion, his growth started to happen within his life. And he realized, I've got to go back and get restored with my family. So he came back to get restored with his family. You have to understand, and that time he was away, he missed out on a lot of things that his family was going through. Memories that he'll never get back. And in fact, his family had moved on. His wife was now remarried. And so even with all these changes, there was this desire to want to get restored with them. And I love what his ex-wife said to me. She said, it took time, but over time, this is what she said, forgiveness and restoration occurred. She goes, what was fractured and broken, God had healed and restored. Now, why do I share that story with you? Because it's what I call a divine reversal. A time in our lives we're going down a certain path, and without even knowing, God steps in and says, I need to redirect the direction that you're going. Is that a biblical principle? Yes, because throughout Scripture we see divine reversals. We'll see in our story of Esther today, but perhaps the one that maybe many of you probably know even more than Esther is how about the life of Joseph? His brothers came in, what do? They sell him into slavery to go to Potiphar's house, and all these things begin to unfold, and all these actions were meant to destroy Joseph, but then all of a sudden, guess what happens? There's a famine in the land, and the brothers that sold him into slavery had to come back, had to go to Egypt, the only place that had food, and guess who they went back to? Joseph, the man that was second in power to Pharaoh. And this is what Joseph says to his brothers in Genesis 50:20, a reminder that sometimes things in our lives look bad, but God says, I can reverse them and turn them into good. He says the following, he goes, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many today. And so that's the power of not just seeing the life of Joseph or this man, but in our story of Esther today, we're going to see a divine reversal where God takes the evil actions of one man who we know by now is Haman, and he says, I'm going to take those actions, I'm going to turn it for good. I'm going to turn it for my glory and for my honor. So as we look at this passage, I want to encourage you guys. As I've said before, it's not just a story in the historical past, it is a reality for your life as well. What is God saying to you? Because we're going to find in our own lives, we're going to see attributes of Esther and Mordecai and Haman. And so the question is, as we see God working in their lives, how are we allowing God to work in our lives? Because it's very clear that God not only has control of the details of our lives, but He can take our bad choices and that bad choices that others make, and He can turn them towards good. So before we jump into chapter 5, I'm going to do a quick review, especially if you have not been here the last few weeks. But we talked last week. It was Esther's moment of decision. It was a time where, faced with a decree by the king that, listen, all the Jews would be destroyed, killed, and annihilated, she is now being faced with a decision prompted by Mordecai to go before the king and plead for their people to be saved. And so what do we find Esther? She's reluctant. She's fearful before the king. She's worried about her own life. And we've talked about how so often in our own lives that we get called by God to go do something, but what do we often allow happen? Reluctance and fear to hold us back from doing what God has called us to do. And so in this reluctance and fear, she reminds herself that she has got to be faithful to what God has called her to do for what? For such a time as this. And is that not the reality for all of us sitting here right now? That God is looking at you right now. He has uniquely placed you exactly where you are, with the people in your life, with the position, the job that you have. He's saying, I have placed you there just like Esther for such a time as this. Will you respond to my providential call upon your life? And so as the story unfolds, Esther responds in a powerful way to go before the king. But there are two truths that I shared last week that we have to keep in mind as we respond to God's call. And here's the first one. We cannot do this without God's help. I told you last week, every time I read Esther, I thought the greatest scene of Esther was when she went before the king, which we'll see today. And the king, what? He gave her favor in her eyes. But I told you, that is not the key moment for Esther. The key moment is not when she went to the throne room of King Xerxes. The key moment for Esther is when she went into the throne room of heaven before the King of Kings. And it was before him she humbled herself and says, I need you to help me go through this. I need your strength. I need your direction. I need your wisdom. It is in that moment where the greatest moment of her life ever occurred, before God himself. And see, there's many of you right here, God is calling you to do something. And while there's nothing wrong with going and getting advice and going and asking other people for direction, I'm going to tell you something right now. The greatest thing you can do to start playing in your life to live for God is get on your knees in his throne room and seek his face. And he will guide you like he did Esther. But secondly, besides realizing she couldn't do this without God's help, the second truth that we learned was that we, like Esther, must display an unwavering commitment and acceptance of God's outcome. Because what did Esther say in verse 16 of chapter 4? She says, then I'll go to the king. So she's making that conscious decision. I'm going to respond to what God has called me to do. And she says, even though it's against the law, she realizes there's a consequence for her going there. But this is what she says. And if I perish, I perish. How many of you today, when God is calling you to do something, you have that same mindset? You said, Lord, I will respond to what you've called me to do, no matter the outcome. Because I said it's not just the challenge of responding to God's call, it's the surrendering of your will over to what he desires and saying, God, I seek your glory more than I seek any benefit for me. And so that's where Esther's at. And so we close here at chapter 4 with the final scene. Esther goes to Mordecai, and she encourages Mordecai and the Jews to join her in 3 days of fasting and prayer as she goes before King Xerxes. And I'm going to tell you something. There's things right now in your life that God is saying you got to make a major decision about. I don't know what it could be. It could be a relationship, could be about a job. But I'll tell you, if you want to seek God's face and approval, go before him in prayer and fasting. Surrender your will to what he has, and we'll see what God does through that. So let's pick up here, chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. And it says the following. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to his palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hands. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So we've already talked about last week and today that what? Esther was fearful to go before the king. Because at that time, the queen did not have full access to the king. She had to get privileged by the king to come into his presence. And so here she is standing there, knowing the risk involved, knowing that it could cost her life. But what she recognizes is something very powerful that we all have to know. That there are times in our lives we are called to fast and mourn, but when that time is over, it is time for action. And Esther realized, I have fasted and mourned before the Lord, but I can't stay in that state forever. I've got to now respond to what God has called me to do. And right now, maybe you're still in a time of mourning and fasting for whatever reason, but God is going to say that time is going to end, and I'm going to call you to action like I called Esther. So here she is, and what happens is so powerful. Because she stands before the king, and what does the verse say? She receives favor in the sight of the king. Now, what gives her this favor? I was reading some commentaries, and they talk about, well, because she was a beautiful woman. And we know that. You go back to chapter 2, verse 7, it says that Esther had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. So that's all that's going on here. We just got a beautiful woman. The king looks at her and says, wow, I'm going to give you favor because, let's just be honest, women, right? We know how men are, right? So that's all we got going on. It's just the beauty of this woman. That's what's making the king do whatever she wants. I think if we just look at her outer beauty, we've missed the power of what God is doing in this story. For sure, her outer beauty played a role, but I'm going to tell you something. It was more than just her beauty. Her favor before the king came from God himself, just as he had given her favor back in chapter 2 when the king chose her as the next queen. You see, you might say, well, BJ, you sure about that? Well, look, if it was beauty alone, maybe the story would be a little bit different. Remember Queen Vashti in chapter 1? The passage in chapter 1 says she was beautiful as well. But what we see is that she didn't receive the approval of the king. She received his anger and wrath. Now we know it came about because she wouldn't dance in front of him and his drunk friends, right? But her beauty alone did not change the king's choice to say, you are now removed as my queen. So it's not beauty alone that's driving our story. What's driving our story is the unseen hand of God in the life of Esther and Mordecai to fulfill the purpose and plan that he's called her to do and for him to do. And that's the powerful thing. Because there's some of you right now, you know God has called you to do something, but you're saying, God, I don't see you, I don't hear you, I don't even know where you're at right now. And little do you know that our God is working in your life with an unseen hand, leading and directing. And the question is, will you surrender to what he's doing? But I want to make a side point here before we move on, because a few weeks ago I challenged the men about how to be godly men, how to be godly husbands. Well, today I want to encourage the women of this room. You see, the greatest beauty that you'll possess as a woman is not what is displayed on the outside. It is what God sees on the inside. Certainly, we all value looking appropriate and presentable. I understand all that and taking care of yourself. But the greatest desire that you should have in your life is to reflect the inner beauty of a heart after God and not the outer beauty that this world talks about. See, I see some young women in this room. I'm going to tell you something. The greatest beauty you will ever possess is when you say, I want to have a heart after God. I love Proverbs 31. Many of you know it. The context is about a virtuous wife, but please understand that it speaks to all women, whether you're married in this room or not. But this is what it says in verse 30. It says, charm is deceitful or deceptive, and beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And yes, Esther was a beautiful woman on the outside, but her greatest display of beauty, you know when it occurred? When she went before God and humbled herself and sought His heart and His desire, not her own. That's what God is doing. Do you think that the church can move forward, that God can accomplish His purposes simply on the hands of men? No, it's been the women who've been behind the men, who have pushed them, who've encouraged them. It's their godliness that is allowed. I'm telling you, one of the greatest revivals I ever read about, you want to know how it was started? Godly women cried out to God on their knees in prayer. And it led to the revival in the areas where all the Welsh live, in Wales. God wants to raise up just not godly men, but godly women who have a heart after Him. And young men in this room right now, I'm going to tell you something. The world will tell you what to look for in a woman. And I'm not saying outer beauty is wrong, but don't ever substitute outer beauty for inner beauty. I tell my son all the time, I said, Lucas, if you ever decide to get married one day, go seek a Proverbs 31 woman. Because it is not what I am telling you to seek for, it is what God is telling you to seek out for. And so that's the challenge for us today. That all of you would seek to have that inner beauty of a heart after God, to let God use you what He's called you to do. So we move on our story to verse 3 and 4. And this is what it said. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given even to you half of my kingdom. So you kind of see the story unfolding. Not only does she have the king's favor, but the king's like, I'll give you whatever you want. I'll give you half the kingdom. That's just kind of an exaggerating way of saying, hey, whatever you need, I'm here for. I'll take care of you. And so we see Esther's response there in verse 4. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come to a feast that I have prepared for the king. So what does she respond to the king? She says, look it, I would like both you and Haman, we all know Haman from our story, right? Will come to a banquet that I have prepared. So as we get to unpack verses 5 and 7, what happens? Haman and Xerxes both go to her banquet. And then all of a sudden, this conversation that we just had, it repeats itself all over again. It's like Groundhog's Day, right? Here we go again, because what happens is the king says to Esther, what's your request? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. I mean, he's ready. He's like, Esther, I'm ready to give you what you want, all right? And then what Esther says is the same thing. If it pleases the king, what? If I have found favor in your sight, if it pleases the king to grant my wish, fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I'll prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So let's stop here for a moment, because we know Xerxes is not really the best ruler, right? But guys, we can relate to this, can't we? I mean, how many times have you just said, I just wish the woman in my life would tell me what she wants, right? That's Xerxes. He's like, come on, Esther, you're killing me here. Will you please give me a little bit of direction? Tell me what you want. You keep, every time I come tell you, I'll do whatever you want, you keep telling me you want, I'll let you know down the road, right? A lot of, I see a lot of guys smiling out there just like, I can relate to Xerxes. So really, why these mind games by Esther, as we call it, right, men? Why these mind games? Why don't you just tell me what you want? Why don't you just tell Xerxes the fact that you are petitioning or requesting that he will step in and save the Jewish people from annihilation? Well, the text doesn't tell us, but I'll give you my own personal thoughts. I believe what we see here by Esther, she is wisely and skillfully, listen, maneuvering the king and Haman into a position that will prepare them for when she's ready to tell them about her request. Now you ask me, why would I say that? Because you have to understand, Haman is a very powerful man. He's the right hand of the king. And we've seen throughout our whole story, what has Haman been able to do? To manipulate King Xerxes to do whatever he wants. So Esther understands what she is facing with the influence of Haman. But what she does is a great job here. She's using strategy. She's a good strategist to lure them to where she needs them to accomplish what God has called her to do. Not through deceit, but in a skillful way. There's a powerful lesson here to learn by what Esther's doing, because when we respond to God, we have to understand we must be cautious not in just what we do, but how we do it. Because I've seen many people eager and excited to go stand for the gospel, to go stand for God's truth, but in their eagerness, they have caused more damage and destruction than good. I was talking with a gentleman this week, and he said, BJ, pray for my son. I said, what's going on? He's just doing a lot of issues. And I said, well, do you think he'll ever come to church? He said, I'm praying for him. But he goes, there was an overzealous Christian who came into his life a few years back and beat him over the head with the Bible, and he refuses to step into church again. You see, our intentions may be pure, but we have to know about how we go about sharing those intentions. And so what we see here with Esther is that there needs to be a skillful way in how we share the truth with the world around us. Did I say compromise the truth? I did not say that. But there needs to be wisdom in about how we go about sharing that truth with the world that we live in. That's why one of my favorite verses ever is 1 Peter 3, 15 and 16. You guys probably know it by now because I say it a lot. But it says this: if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Are you ready? If you're walking on the street and someone comes to you and says, why do you believe in Jesus Christ? Can you tell them where your hope comes from? But he says, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then if people speak against you, which if you stand for the truth right now in the world we live in, they will speak against you. But he says this: they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. And so what we've seen so far in our story, God is giving favor to Esther, that she has sought Him. She has gone for that inner beauty of a heart after God, and she's using the wisdom that God has made to prepare these people for that request. We must do the same as we seek God. Humble ourselves and have wisdom as we go about sharing that. So we move to verse 9. And it says, and Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. He's out there, he's skipping, he's having fun, right? Because not only has he got this great power and prestige, but now Queen Esther only wants him and the king to come to a banquet. Life is good for Haman. You ever said that? You know it's never good to say, right? Life is good because you know what's going to happen next, right? But it is. Everything seems to be perfectly lined up for Haman. But in the same verse, what does it say? But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, that he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. See, this joy and this gladness quickly turned to wrath because of Mordecai. And this wrath, I want you to understand, it's more than just having an anger towards Mordecai. It's more than just feeling offended by Mordecai. It is referring to a consuming fire, like a fire consuming a building. In other words, this anger and wrath that he has for Mordecai is taking him over. It's controlling him. Where does this source of his anger come from? We've already talked about it. Haman's a very arrogant and proud man. And he expected everyone to literally tremble before him. That Hebrew word for tremble, it's like an earthquake, like we saw in Turkey and Syria, that brings everything down. He wanted people to tremble. He wanted people, when they saw Haman walk in the streets, that they had a fear of this man, the power that he held. And I want to make this point before we move on. And I don't know where you're at in your walk with the Lord, but I'm going to tell you this. If you're following the path of Haman, you need a reversal in your life. Because there's some of you right here today that are allowing anger and hatred towards others to dominate and consume you like a fire consuming a building. And I'll tell you, if you allowed uncontrolled anger to take over your life, there's only one end. It is destruction. Do not follow the path of Haman, because look at what his fate is. It leads to his destruction, and I think that we need to keep in mind Proverbs 19:11. This is what it says. It says, good sense, or better translation is wisdom, makes one what? Slow to anger. And it is his glory to overlook an offense. So if you want to avoid Haman's path today, be slow to anger and overlook an offense. So we go to verse 10 through 14, and as we go to those verses, what begins to happen in our story is these details of Haman's plot to kill Mordecai come before us. But before we see those details, in verse 11, where's Haman? It says he's bragging and boasting before his family and friends about all his riches and possessions. Can you picture him? He's like, hey guys, look at me. Look how good I am. Look at I own this. I've got this power and prestige. Look at all the great things. He's bragging and boasting about himself. In the midst of this, he says, in the midst of all that I have, guess what, guys? Esther's only invited me and the king to her banquet. You know people like that, right? Everything's about them. What we see right here in Haman, he's a classic narcissist, isn't he? And as a narcissist, this is what he loves. He loves to be admired by others, to be the center of attention, to expect special treatment because of his higher status. But I'll tell you that just like every narcissist that I know, they're never content. Because what we see in all that he possesses and all of his esteem, his wrath towards Mordecai continues to consume him. See, there's a powerful lesson here about Haman. Because does not Haman, we think Haman is just this awful guy over here, right? But do you know that Haman reflects what our world tells us we should be doing? Doesn't it? The world says you should go after possessions. You should go after prestige. If you do that, guess what? It's going to make you happy. But it did not make Haman happy. It made him more angry and more hateful. And today, if you're trying to pursue finding happiness and joy in the things of this world, I will tell you, you'll be like Haman. You'll be unsatisfied. So we move on to our story. We see that unsatisfaction in Haman, because what does it say in verse 12? He says, yet all this, all these possessions, all this prestige that I have, it's worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. In other words, the full fledge of his wrath is beginning to be put on display, because he doesn't desire anything more than to see Mordecai dead. And so in verse 13 and 14, with this desire for Mordecai's death, it tells us, then his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, let a gallows, and a gallows would just picture a big stake, and a person would be impaled on that stake. That's how they did it in Persia. And so he said, let a gallows or a stake 50 cubits high, 70 feet high, be made. And in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it, then go joyfully with the king to the feast. And so Haman's wife's advice to Haman was something that was pleasurable in his eyes about how to get rid of Mordecai, because what's the last verse that says here in chapter 5? It says, the idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So you picture where we're at right now. But I want to be very clear before we go to chapter 6. Haman reflects the dangers of what it says in Proverbs 26:12. Because I want you to hear this. This is what it says. Do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? I mean, how many of you today are trying to walk your own path, doing it your way, trying to pat yourself in the back, say, look how great I am. You're trying to do it without God's help, without God's direction. But it says, do you see a man like this, a man like Haman in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. And as we will see in chapter 6 and even into chapter 7, we will see the foolishness of Haman and the destruction that it leads him to do. So as we get into chapter 6, the plot has been set now to execute Mordecai. But you know what we're going to see in this chapter? God move in a powerful way. God's going to step in and do what I call, once again, I mentioned earlier, divine reversal. Because you know what's going to happen? I believe that Haman went to bed sound asleep. He's like, finally, life's going to be good. I got my plan in place. I already know how to manipulate the king to get what I want, right? So I've got my plan in place. I can picture right now Mordecai in that 75-foot stake just sitting there in front of all the people to see. That anyone defies me, that's what's going to happen to them. But as he's sound asleep, excited about what tomorrow brings, you know what else is going on? King Xerxes cannot fall asleep. Unasleep, restless is Xerxes. And to think that he just had a long day at work, This is God once again moving the details, and I'll show you very clear, because this is what it says in verse 1. On that night the king could not sleep. He gave orders to bring the book of memorial deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. So here he is, the king Xerxes, unable to sleep, and so to fill his restless night, guess what he decides to do? He says, I want the book of records to be read. All those things that have happened year after year through the Persian Empire, come and read them to me. Now he must be really restless, because that's not something exciting to do. I'll give you a contemporary example, what I did last week. I had to go through all my tax papers and look at my bills for the last few years, right? You guys ever done that? Well, if you're restless, try that, okay? Because it's not fun. But that's what Xerxes is doing. He's looking at all these things and trying to, just find a way to get to sleep. But you know what's powerful about these book of records? In our story, Xerxes has been the king of Persia for about 12 years. If you remember in chapter 1, Persian Empire covered 127 provinces, which in kind of ways for us to understand, it went from India to North Africa. That's the vastness of this empire. And so here's Xerxes saying, look, I'd like the book of records to be read, not only of all the events that happened in my 12 years, but all the events that happened in all the kings of Persia that covered this vast empire. So please understand, it's not coming in as like, oh, here's a 10-page book, let's go through it real quick, right? Book after book is being brought in of all these events that have happened throughout the history of the Persian Empire. In the midst of all these records, guess what is read to King Xerxes? We find out here in verse 2 and 3. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. Do you see it? Of all that was read, the story that we read back in chapter 2 about Mordecai was read. And this is what the king said. What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? For the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. You remember I said back in chapter 2, there's a few verses at the end, and all of a sudden, here's Mordecai at the right place at the right time, which we say was divinely put there, that he overhears these two people talking about assassinating the king. And I said, keep that in mind, because God will use those details to further His plan in Esther and Mordecai's life. But it's not till what? Years later, that all of a sudden this information is revealed right at the exact time to the king, and the king says, what's been done for this man? Once again, the unseen hand of God, isn't it? He helps a sleepless king find rest by having these records read, and it just happens to lead, as those records are being read, to the exaltation of Mordecai. And as the king is reading about these records in verse 4, guess who happens to come to the palace? You all know, that's why you're all smiling, or you should be. Haman, yes! Our good friend Haman, who slept so well last night. He's so excited because today's the day to get rid of Mordecai. And so this is what it says in verse 4. And the king said, who was in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And so in verse 5, the king what? He calls for Haman to come into the throne room. And then we see this interaction in verse 6. To not think God is in the details of this, man, we're missing out, because God is moving everything together. And so this is Haman now coming to have Mordecai executed. He goes before the king, and the king says this, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? I love that question to Haman. Because what's his response? Well, Haman says to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? He's like, man, this is great. I came here to get rid of Mordecai, and the process of getting rid of him, now the king wants to honor me. I'm feeling good. You can just see a little smirk on his face, right? A little kind of putting his shoulders up, say, look, life is good. And so in verse 7 and 9, Haman, who thinks he's going to be the one honored, he begins to lay out how the king should honor this person. He says, look the king should take his royal robes and put them on that man. Then a horse that only the king has rode, let him ride that horse. Oh, and by the way, with that little smirk on his face, let him be paraded through the streets and let the people just exalt and glorify him. In other words, you know what Haman is saying? King, you want to honor someone? Let him be honored just like you are honored as the king. In other words, be treated just like you are as the king. But little does Haman know, his pride and arrogance is going to lead to his destruction. And guess what? The exaltation of his enemy. Because this is what we find in verse 10 and 11. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman has to take the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Do you see the divine reversal going on here? God has taken the evil plans of Mordecai to evil plans of Haman to kill Mordecai, and he has turned it to where now Haman is publicly exalting Mordecai. In my own mind, it doesn't say it in the passage, but you know what I picture? I picture Haman just putting his head down and be like, you got to be kidding me, saying underneath his breath. And he begins to walk Mordecai out, and he's shaking his head in utter disgust, utter humiliation. And he's telling the people, well, you got to exalt him. And he's trying his best to look like he's got a smile on his face, but the disgust and the anger goes over. And I can picture he's walking down that street. You know what he walks past? The very gallows that he had built to kill this man. Now he's exalting him. And wait till next week when we see what eventually happens with Haman. But a great picture. And here's the side note I want you guys to understand before we go to our conclusion. That God is behind the scenes bringing about His providential plan. I have said it every week, and maybe I need to say it again, because once again, when you guys come into this church, maybe it's your first time or your 20th time, I don't know. I don't know what's going on in your life, but I want this story to be more than just as about Esther. I want this story to remind you of the God that we serve. That He's working in our lives in ways that we can't see. That His providential call upon your life will come to pass. It's a matter of whether you choose to surrender to what He's doing in your life. Because we see it so clear here. And then specifically in this situation here where the reversal occurs, Haman is an example of this truth that comes from Psalm 75, 6 and 7. Here's the truth. For not from the east or from the west, and not from the wilderness comes lifting up. Listen, but it is God who executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another. It is God who what? Humbles, and God who exalts. And the question today is, I'll tell you what, you want to be exalted? Humble yourself before God. And when you humble Him, what did I tell you? Not only will God be exalted in your life, but He will exalt you as well. So we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up with verse 12 next week of chapter 6. But I want to give you one closing challenge. This is it. To patiently wait upon the Lord. I love this psalm. This is Psalm 33, 20 and 22. David's writing it. If you know anything about David's life, he always went through challenges, didn't he? He knew what it meant to wait upon the Lord. So he says this, "Oh, our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in Him because we trust in His holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you." And look, at everyone in this room is waiting upon the Lord for something. I promise you, you are. I don't know what you're waiting upon. Maybe you're waiting upon some relationship in your life to be healed. Maybe you're waiting for some health crisis you're going through, for some resolution of that. Maybe you're praying for God for some resolution over a decision that you've made that has caused nothing but hurt and pain for those around you. Maybe you've got a Haman in your life right now who's coming in and trying to break you down and your family down. But right now, there's everyone in this room, and we are waiting upon the Lord for something. So how do we wait for the Lord? How do I patiently wait upon the Lord? Well, I'll tell you, you can't just sit by and do nothing. If you're going to wait upon the Lord, we've learned to follow the path of Esther and Mordecai. Because what do they teach us? That as we wait upon the Lord, we wait upon Him what? Not when the circumstances change. Do you get what I'm saying? Because people say, I'll wait upon the Lord, and when He changes circumstances, then I'll do something. No, we wait upon the Lord in spite of our circumstances. And as we wait, we do what they do. We get on our knees, we pray and fast, and we surrender to what God has called us to do, no matter the outcome. See, how many of you today are waiting for your circumstances to change? It's like I told the first service. I said, we're all like, wow, God, look how God's working through the circumstances of our story, right? But you know what God is doing more than circumstances and what He's working through? He's working in the life of Esther and Mordecai. And see, right now, God is saying, do you understand? In the midst of your circumstances, I am calling you to wait patiently to move forward upon that call. Because what He's saying is, you may say, I'm waiting for that change to happen. And God is saying, you're missing out. It's not the change of your circumstances that I'm focused upon. It's how I can change you. How I can create in you a heart and a love for me beyond where you've ever been in your life. And maybe that's what we have to wait upon for all of us. It's for God to do the work He needs to do in our own lives. Because this is powerful. Because I can't tell you right now, and I never will promise you something I can't give. I don't know when and how God will bring a reversal in your life. I don't know what tomorrow brings. I don't know what your struggles are, but I'll tell you this, that we would not be sitting here today without a divine reversal. Because the very foundation and the faith of the Christianity rests upon a divine reversal. It's where we get our hope. So what's this reversal? You see, because of our sin, where are we going? We're on a path of destruction. In fact, people don't want to hear this, but you know our sin has made us objects of God's wrath. Yeah, our sin makes us an object of God's wrath. He is a holy and righteous and good God. And so He looks upon us with our sin and says, look, your path is going down destruction. You're an object of my wrath. I must punish sin. But you know what else we know about God? He is also merciful and gracious. Because He says, because you're going down this path, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to send my Son, Jesus Christ, to rescue you from those gallows. I'm going to send Him to give His life for you so that you can experience a divine reversal. So you can go from bondage to sin to freedom. You can go from hope and despair to hopelessness and despair to hope and peace and joy. And more importantly than that, you know what the divine reversal does for us? He says you're going down a path of death, but I'm going to give you a path of life. I love what Jesus says here in John 5:24. He says, I tell you the truth. Those who listen to my message and believe in God who sent me have eternal life. They will never be condemned for their sins. But they have already passed from what? Death into life. That means a divine reversal has occurred in their life. And so as I go to prayer, I just want to throw a final thought. If you're a believer today and you're going through a difficult time, you're waiting for God to do a reversal, I'll tell you this, He already has. Because of His death on that cross, no matter what you go through in this life, you do not approach it without peace, hope, and joy because of who He is and what He has done for you. But today, if you don't know the Lord, you have not come to that cross where you've asked Him to forgive you of your sins. I'm going to tell you something. You will not find a reversal in your life by the things of this world. The possessions, whatever you're pursuing, will never lead to satisfaction. But it is coming to the cross and saying, Lord, I surrender my life to you. I ask you to forgive me. That is at that very moment where God says, I will reverse your life and give you that peace and joy that I have for you. I pray today that no one walk away today without knowing the certainty of what the cross means to their lives. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.